Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Live Chat with James. I'm glad you're tuning in. I'm James Cousineau coming to you from the ProPic Studios here in Vancouver, British Columbia. And as we know, Donald Trump's big touted Liberation Day has come and gone. We are now past midnight, or at least we are close enough anyway. It's 11:48 p.m. here on the west coast of Canada. And this is, to me, insulting in so many ways to people around the world. Now, generally, Liberation Day is a day in which people were liberated from different forces, such as when the certain parts of the world were liberated by, the rest of the world, the U.S., the U.K., and such. When people were liberated from the Nazis and things like that. And for Donald Trump to take this and to basically, decry or denounce the meaning and the power of the term Independence Day, I think is insulting to so many countries. You look at Denmark, when they were liberated from the Nazis, that's a day. That was a liberation day. That was a powerful day. That was a historic day. And for Trump to make his tariffs, this big announcement that he's doing tariffs back against countries for reciprocal tariffs or just tariffs for the simple point of saying that he's put pressure on the international community, I just think it's a joke. And let's face it, he's talking so much shit that he carries toilet paper so he can wipe his mouth after he speaks. And that is Donald Trump for you. Now, let's take a deeper look at the tariffs that came out today and what that means for the world. Now, of course, we know that there were less impactful tariffs that were announced today when it comes to what we were expecting in Canada. But that doesn't mean that more tariffs are not on the way. It doesn't mean that there is, a warming up to Canada when it comes to the tariffs that have been put in place. We know that it's day to day. We never know what that orange clown is thinking or what he's going to do next. And some people say it's a negotiating tactic, but it's not. The simple truth is that he is implementing these tariffs as a way to generate tax revenue, to create tax breaks, and to fund the tax breaks and programs for the rich. And what many people who support the tariff program are not understanding is that it is the U.S. citizen who pays the tariffs. And by doing so, Donald Trump will use that money to fund the tax breaks and the programs for the rich. And that is what it comes down to. It is not a beneficial program to negotiate or to use as a negotiating tactic to alienate your allies and your friends around the world. And that is not how you go about negotiating, for one. And number two, to utilize it and to really talk about that while insulting and demeaning other nations is also just unheard of in the world of diplomacy. And that should be remembered. I know that the nations in which he is disparaging will not forget what he has done in terms of not just the tariffs, but the way he talks about them. Here in Canada, for example, the Canadian citizens have put their foot down and said enough is enough. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to listen to Donald Trump, and we sure as hell are not going to stand for him insulting us. Now, he came out today and he's talking about Liberation Day, and he's talking about how the world has raped, ravaged, and pillaged the United States for decades, for generations. And of course, he is the savior of it all. And that we know is also bullshit. There have been many intelligent people in that White House long before him. And I'm not just talking presidents and vice presidents. I'm talking about advisors and people running different departments of the nation, including international trade. They are not idiots. They know how to negotiate trade agreements, and they sure as hell understood that they were not being raped and pillaged when it came to the U.S. trade agreements that they entered into. Now, over time, trade agreements do need adjusting. There are different ways in which that comes to fruition, and that is started by dialogue. by sitting down with the nations and saying, look, we need to revisit trade agreements, we need to revisit certain aspects of it. Instead, what he has chosen to do is offer these blanket tariffs while lying out of his face just constantly about how he is subsidizing, or how America is subsidizing all of these nations. And a trade deficit is not a subsidy. And he just does not want to acknowledge that because it doesn't fit his narrative. And that is a shame, because he is lying to his own people, to the people that voted him in and the people that voted against him. Regardless, he is lying to the American citizens and to the world. When he, for example, talks about tariffs on Canadian dairy because we've been ripping them off for years on that, that is not the case. We've never actually charged tariffs on dairy. Let's talk about milk in particular. When the trade amount hits a certain threshold, it is totally free from tariffs until it hits that certain threshold of amounts coming into Canada. Then over and above that, there are tariffs. But they've never reached that level, and they probably never will. And that is what, the discrepancy is that he keeps giving all of these false narratives about everybody taking advantage of the United States, and that's just not true. He is so full of shit, it's just disgusting. So let's take a look. Again, he calls it Liberation Day, which again, I just find totally disgusting. And, he should choose a different word, because Liberation Day means so much more. Again, you look at the people that were liberated from the Nazis, and, that's... for him to try to appropriate that term is just insulting to the lives that were lost and the genocides that happened. And yeah, it's just wrong to start with. Now, of course, we know this date is branded by Trump as a pivotal moment for imposing sweeping reciprocal tariffs on imports to the United States, and he's elicited significant global attention and unease. And again, a lot of that is because it's not based on reality. It's not based on truth. It's based on Trump's view of the world. Now, economically, the announcement of a baseline 10% tariff on all imports, with higher rates up to 49% in some cases, and even higher if you look at certain regions. And that's targeting specific countries, and that sent shockwaves through the global markets, and the stock markets have been experiencing volatility, and the U.S. futures dropping sharply after the announcement. The Dow futures fell over 900 points. The Standard & Poor futures, they declined by 3.38%, and analysts describe this as a worst-case scenario. That's for the markets fearing that the aggressive duties could slow global growth, disrupt supply chains, and stoke inflation. European and Asian markets also felt the pressure, with investors shifting towards safer assets like bonds and gold, reflecting a broader anxiety about the escalating trade war. And even in India, their markets also saw a dip in relation to the new round of tariffs that have been announced worldwide. Now, internationally, leaders and governments responded with a blend of resistance, retaliation, and attempts at negotiation. And different countries took different stands and different ways to deal with this. Now, of course, the European Union is facing a 20% reciprocal tariff on top of the existing duties. And they expressed a desire to negotiate, but warned that all instruments are on the table for retaliation. Now, this is, again, they are trying to be diplomatic, and they want to just sit at the table with the Trump administration and try to work out a trade agreement that everybody can walk away feeling that it was fair and equitable on both sides. What that means is anybody's guess, because we know that Donald Trump doesn't necessarily stick to those trade agreements, even if he's the signatory that enforces it or brings it into existence. Now, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, emphasized the EU's economic strength and readiness to defend its interests, and they definitely are ready to do that. Meanwhile, on a different end, Canada and Mexico, which are key U.S. trading partners, prepared countermeasures, and Canadian Finance Minister Francois Philippe Champagne promised a strong response, while Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected an eye for an eye approach, but signaled a comprehensive plan to address the tariffs. Now, if you look elsewhere in the world to the responses, Japan and South Korea, along with China, reportedly considered coordinated responses, although official statements from Tokyo and Seoul distanced themselves from such suggestions. And I think that has to do with the fact that China is looking at higher tariff rates than Korea or Japan. So that would be shooting themselves in the foot to align with China there and to go at it as a trilateral group against the Trump tariffs. Again, with the Chinese tariffs, the U.S. tariffs against China being so much higher, I think that it would be detrimental to those nations to align with China. Some nations have adopted a more conciliatory stance, seeking to appease Trump and avoid worst of the tariffs, and that includes the UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Now, he's engaged in productive negotiations for a potential trade deal, while Vietnam preemptively slashed duties, and that was on certain goods to mitigate the impact of the U.S. tariffs. Meanwhile, critics like the former U.S. trade official Michael Froman warned that Trump's policies might inadvertently bolster China's global influence as the U.S. shifts towards a protectionist model reminiscent of Beijing's own economic strategies. And that is true because you may see nations that historically have traded with the U.S. to walk away from U.S. trade and start opening new markets elsewhere. And Canada is a prime example of that. Canada is very clear in the fact that our relationship will never go back to where it was, and that Canada is entering into trade agreements with nations away from the United States, and that includes in energy. Now, the interesting point of that, folks, is that with the new Prime Minister in Canada, he is not seen to be amenable to the expansion of pipelines in Canada to move our crude oil or our bitumen to different ports in terms of expanding pipelines so we can export more of it to the Asian Pacific or other regions over to Europe and so forth. So again, you know, what can we do in terms of the current infrastructure that is there with the pipelines going to the West Coast and so forth? But again, it is a big issue that's coming up in the April 28th election in Canada. Now, when we look at the big picture, of course, we know that, again, it could put off a lot of trade out of the U.S., and people are saying that's going to bring back jobs to the U.S. And I understand that in theory it sounds great. But realistically, to re-engage the manufacturing industry in the United States, you're going to have to build the infrastructure to do so. And that would include building new warehousing facilities, new manufacturing facilities. These are not just popped up overnight. This takes planning, it takes building and construction, it takes equipment, and of course, it takes finance because it costs a lot of money to relocate plants from, say, China or Beijing or India, Singapore, Malaysia, or even from Mexico, from Canada. It takes a lot of money to do that, especially for well-established companies that have the supply chains already in place. And to look at replacing those supply chains can be quite difficult as well. Now, even if you were, let's move forward from that, even if you were to have the new facilities in place to manufacture, you are now still stuck buying all of the raw materials, a lot of times from overseas or from other nations, because at the end of the day, the U.S. does not have all of the raw minerals or the textiles or so many other things that are needed to manufacture. So therefore, they are still going to be importing the goods that are required to manufacture. And again, those are going to be struck by tariffs. We've talked about it before, that even when you get to the point that they are up and running and manufacturing again in the US, your labor costs are exponentially higher because you have to pay for a lot more in terms of WorkSafe or WCB. You've got to have safety standards. You have to pay certain level of wages and all of that. Whereas overseas in Bangladesh, for example, the labor costs are so much less, and therefore it's going to drive the price of these items up even higher. And when Donald Trump says that America doesn't care that they're going to pay more as long as it's made in America, I think that he's going to find that when the American people are running out of food because they can't afford it, given that everything is costing so much more, and that is a direct correlation between the tariffs and the added costs, then I think that he's going to see a lot more people turning against him in terms of the dissatisfaction that's happening. Now, let's continue on to the international response to the tariffs, and that would be, you're looking at the public sentiment as reflected in various polls and media showed growing distrust among U.S. allies. In Germany, for example, only 16% of respondents trusted the U.S. as an ally, while in France, a majority supported boycotting U.S. goods in response to a perceived economic bullying. And here in Canada, once again, Mark Carney has declared the old relationship with the U.S. as over, signaling a pivot towards partners like Britain and France, and they are replacing the U.S. markets for export with other partners and trade agreements worldwide. And even if the tariffs come off once those new trade agreements are in place, of course, those goods, that volume of goods will not be available for the U.S. to repurchase and to try to bring back that trade because we've now committed it to other buyers. So again, it is really the long-term viability is not there to just restore things as they once were. It's just not going to happen. And it's going to take a long time for people to build that trust with the U.S. as a reliable partner. And it's definitely not going to happen over the next 4 years. And that's just the honest truth. Now, overall, the world's reaction to Liberation Day has been one of apprehension and strategic recalibration. While Trump frames it as a triumph for American economic sovereignty, many global actors see it as a destabilizing move that could unravel decades of trade liberalization, prompting a mix of defiance, adaptation, and cautious diplomacy. So again, that is pretty much from the different aspects or different corners of the globe as to how they are reacting and handling the tariff situation. Now, we also know that, as I said, there's a lot of rhetoric coming out, and it is insulting to a lot of nations because a lot of nations have fair and equitable trade agreements with the U.S. And they were negotiated, some of them under Trump, some of them under other presidents and different administrations. But at the end of the day, for the U.S. government to come out as strong as they did to accuse foreign nations of raping, pillaging, and plundering the U.S. is just very insulting. And a lot of people are very angered by that because it was trade agreements that were fair and equitable. There needed to be some adjustment to some, absolutely. Some nations were very heavy in tariffs and they needed to readjust. But again, to go against all of your previous administrations, whether that's the Obama, whether it's Reagan, whether it's Carter, I mean, you can go back in history. And to see the way that the allies of the U.S. are being treated is nothing less than disrespectful, ignorant, and uncalled for. And that is going to cause a lot of issues when it comes to dealing with the United States in the future. So that is pretty much what you're looking at in that regard. Now, we can move on from that and let's talk about the extraditions that are going on. We'll cover that again. We've talked about it previously. But with the extraditions that are going on to El Salvador, a plane touched down, actually several planes touched down the other day, again sending these people that are accused of being gang members without any due process. Now, there were what was not shown on a lot of cameras. However, a few reporters did pick it up and some of those even didn't report on it. But there were 8 women that were also included in those transports down to the prison in El Salvador. Now, let's take a look at that. A lot of people are screaming, but at the end of the day, let's not forget that women can be gang members. Women can be more vicious, violent when it comes to violent tendencies than men in these gangs. And I say that because when you look at the street gangs of LA back in the 80s and 90s, as the evolution came about, there were a lot of female gangs popping up. And the reason why they became more vicious, more violent, and more aggressive is because they had something to prove to the male gangs. They wanted to set their dominance. They wanted to show that they are ready to challenge the power and the violence of the male-dominated gang, the gang activities and the gang groups. That the women wanted to show that they were just as mean, that they could put up and deal with the men as well. So again, the premise that just because they're women, they are not gang members doesn't fly. However, the fact that more and more information is coming out about people who have been wrongfully sent to these El Salvadorian prisons should give reason to pause in the fact that they are not all gang members. Some people, including that father from Wisconsin, he was from El Salvador. He went to the U.S. and claimed asylum and was granted. He was wrongfully accused of being a gang member, which a judge and the police didn't believe. They found that there was no evidence whatsoever of that. Released him with an order that forbid the U.S. from deporting him back to El Salvador, which is exactly what the Trump administration did. And ICE, they deported him back to El Salvador, where he had fled because his life was in danger. And now we don't know if he is going to be executed by the gangs or others down in El Salvador now that he is in their custody. To take it further, of course, the U.S. has said that they have absolutely no authority and no ability to return him back to his family in the U.S. for the fact that they do not have jurisdiction over the penal system or the justice system in El Salvador. Yeah, that to me is just the biggest breach of human rights. And if this individual is killed in custody or otherwise down there, I think that they should be held liable for that death. And that is the way I see it. Now, we can look at, again, the different gang activity. And yes, that is a problem in the U.S. It's been a problem going back for decades and decades. And it's one that has been always at the forefront of mind of security when it comes to national security, regional and community security and safety of all. But is it right to turn and circumvent the U.S. Constitution, U.S. laws, international laws, human rights regulations, and agreements? No, I don't think that it is. I think that this is just a vicious way to turn around and try to pull the wool over the average American's eyes. Now, with Donald Trump talking about his tough stance on immigration and deportations, he has basically eliminated any right to the due process of law and to the right of any other legal course of ramification. And that, again, is just so wrong as well. It's not what the U.S. was founded on and built on ever since. And that is just disgusting at how little value they are seeing in the lives of those who are being directly impacted by these deportations. So again, it's a matter of people needing to speak out. And again, there's got to be more transparency coming out of El Salvador. But of course, that is a big issue. The freedom of the press is being suppressed in the United States, but nothing compared to what it is in El Salvador. And the freedom of the press is not necessarily honored. And the journalists that are there do put their lives at risk every day to bring news and stories from that region. And there are other stories that are just off the table that even journalists know that reporting the truth on certain stories could cost them their lives. And yeah, it's a tough balancing act between the ethics and the requirement of journalism versus the real and true threats against the journalists in nations such as El Salvador. Now, when you look at the freedom of the press, of course, it's being threatened in the U.S. as well. There is a war against the news agencies, and whether you believe the right-wing news, the left-wing news, or the center news, the independent news, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. It is a matter that, or it is a fact that the freedom of the press is an essential part of any democracy. It allows for the reporting and the accountability of politicians and public servants, corporations, and so forth when it comes to holding them accountable for their actions. And that's why the freedom of the press is such a big part of democracy and why it needs to be protected. Now, just because Donald Trump may not agree with a reporter, or because they are reporting on stories that Donald Trump and Bargain Basement Barbie, aka Caroline Levitt, just because they are reporting or asking questions that Trump and Bargain Basement Barbie don't like, doesn't mean that they are a fake news organization. It doesn't mean they're an illegal news organization. It doesn't mean that they should be shut down and jailed. But again, it is about protecting that freedom of the press, whether you are here in Canada, whether you are in the US, whether you are in Russia. It is about upholding the different policies and the different regulations worldwide, different agreements that were placed, including the Vienna Agreement, that that there is a real protection of the media, and that seems to be deteriorating day by day. Now, the U.S., for example, has dropped extremely big drop on the Freedom of the Press Index and the Safety of the Press and Journalist Index. And that should be concerning as well to the American people, but also to the international community. Because when a country such as the United States goes from such a leadership role in protecting the freedom of the media, the freedom of journalists, and the integrity of that constitutionally protected activity, then if the U.S. can circumvent it and ignore it and turn their whole opinion upside down, then what's to say that other countries aren't going to follow suit? And we know that they do. For example, India has a horrible track record. They are close to the bottom of the Freedom of the Press Index and the Safety of Media Index and the suppression of journalism. And when they see the U.S., who claims to be this powerful democracy, just totally undermining the value and the need for the media and the press, then of course it empowers and emboldens countries like India to take it even further to what has happened in the past, and that is organized disappearances, executions or assassinations of journalists, harassment, violence, and so much more. And that is a sad day for democracy. It's a sad day for global affairs and really for journalists worldwide. Now, of course, there are times when certain things in the media need to be restricted or just carefully disseminated. And a plain example of that would be when I was in Ukraine. I was covering the war in 2022, and of course at that time I had to be very careful about not releasing details in terms of information on strategic points, munitions depots, police stations, or military camps, and frontline soldiers, all of that. You've got to be very cognizant of the risks that you pose as a journalist when you are reporting. And you are there to report the news, not make the news. And as such, there are very important ways that you protect the frontline soldiers in a war zone, and that is making sure that your geotagging is turned off on your cameras, on your phones, whatever the case is. Making sure that you are not capturing images of sensitive bases or sensitive areas. Making sure that you are not capturing images of troops where there could potentially be identifying landmarks in the picture to help the other side obtain location coordinates. So again, it's about that delicate balance of reporting the truth and what's happening and not putting people at risk. And that's a big difference. Where you need to make sure that that is the balance and the ethics that you follow and responsibility you follow as an accredited journalist. Now, there were times in Ukraine where I was held at gunpoint with machine guns at my head, as well as other things. And the soldiers would take my camera gear, they would take my phone, and they would actually go through it at checkpoints to make sure that there was no sensitive or other identifiable information that could put people at risk. And I didn't have anything to that nature, so I had no problems with it. When it came to making it through those checkpoints, I was very cognizant of my ethics and my responsibilities, but also of the lives that it could put at risk if I didn't follow that code of ethics. So again, I didn't have any problems with them. They would check, they would make sure that on my phone I wasn't communicating with the Russian side, so on and so forth. And then they would, smile and let me go. But again, it's a little nerve-wracking when you are in a war zone and you're being held at gunpoint with machine guns at your head while they go through your footage as a journalist. And so again, it's trying to balance the rights of the media and the freedom of the press with the responsible and ethical reporting of information. So again, that's just an example of many ways in which there is, there is suppression of the media, but then there's also the ethics and responsibilities. And those are completely different. And I just thought I'd explain that differentiation of that balance. So yeah, that is where we are at in terms of the craziness that's happening in the world today. So we need to just really keep in mind that, we need to hold people accountable. It's important for the freedom of the press to do that and to ensure democracy remains as powerful and basically unobtrusive as possible when it comes to daily lives of citizens. I just can't say enough about how disgusting and deplorable I think it is to send people to El Salvadorian prisons. They are cesspools of violence, of disease. They're a cesspool of starvation and violence. It's just horrible. The other night I spoke about receiving footage from a riot in another certain prison in Central or South America. And in that video where they decapitated another prison and walked around holding the individual's head on a machete as if it was some kind of a trophy before they dumped it in a bucket was just horrific. And sometimes as journalists, we see things that we don't report on because we don't want to be the ones to glorify that type of behavior. Now, the whole idea of the inmates who had snuck the phone in and got me that footage, and just so you know, I had nothing to do with it. They sent it to me afterwards. I had nothing to do with them taking the phone into the prison. I had nothing to do with anything ahead of time. I was actually shocked that they sent me the footage at the time. But again, it was sometimes in journalism, you decide not to report on certain stories because you don't want to make people feel empowered to do even more horrific things to garner that footage or that coverage. A while later, we did talk about the conditions, about the concerns of the prisons in that country. But again, we didn't glorify the riots or the tragic lives that were lost. And the last thing that we wanted to be responsible for was to glorify that person who had been decapitated in terms of having that footage put out in the public realm and having his family have to deal with that. That is just beyond reprehensible when it comes to some journalists that do that. Another thing with ProPix Media is that, with the ethics and, as I said, responsibilities, we've been offered contracts to go and chase down, for example, when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were first coming to Vancouver, when they stayed at a certain location. Yeah, we were contacted by members of the UK media and offering us a substantial amount of money to track them down to get exclusive, basically paparazzi style images and videos of them. And we just turned them down because no amount of money is worth our ethics when it comes to those type of agreements or contracts and jobs. So although we do service a lot of international media for news stories or for sporting events and so forth, we definitely do not partake in any type of paparazzi style crap. And that to me is important as well. So again, just so you understand where we're coming from as it relates to integrity and responsibility. But we shall move on there, folks. This is pretty much the end of another live chat with James here at the studios at ProPix TV in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I appreciate you tuning in for another episode. We'll look forward to seeing you. It is my Friday. I will be back Sunday night with a whole new episode and a live chat. So feel free to join me on TikTok here for another live chat with James at 11:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Sunday night. Other than that, folks, have a great weekend. Stay safe. And once again, thanks for tuning in to this episode. Take care and stay safe.